What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors sits down for what should be a simple interview, only to face the most disrespectful host on television? It only took 37 seconds of pure arrogance from Piers Morgan to completely destroy his own show and humiliate himself in front of millions of viewers worldwide. This is the story of how Johnny Depp walked off set, leaving Morgan looking like a fool. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday evening as Johnny Depp settled into the guest chair across from Piers Morgan. The interview was supposed to be about Depp's latest film project, a passion piece he had been working on for years. But Morgan had other plans. He had been preparing for this moment, sharpening his claws like a predator waiting to pounce. "Johnny Depp, welcome to the show," Morgan said with that trademark smirk that had made him famous for all the wrong reasons. His voice carried an edge that immediately put everyone in the studio on alert. "Thank you for having me, Piers," Depp replied politely, his voice calm and respectful. He was dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans, looking relaxed despite the obvious tension already building in the air. Morgan leaned forward in his chair, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "So, Johnny, let's talk about your career. Some people might say you've lost your touch. Your last few films haven't exactly set the box office on fire, have they?" The question caught everyone off guard. This wasn't the gentle warm-up that guests usually received. The cameramen exchanged glances, and the producer in the booth shifted uncomfortably. But Depp handled it with grace. "Well, I think every actor goes through different phases in their career," Depp said thoughtfully. "I've been fortunate to work on projects that I'm passionate about, and that's what matters most to me." But Morgan wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic response. He wanted blood. "Passionate about projects that nobody watches?" Morgan shot back, his voice dripping with condescension. "I mean, when was the last time you had a real hit? Pirates of the Caribbean was what? Over a decade ago?" The studio fell silent. Even the crew members stopped what they were doing. This was supposed to be a promotional interview, not an interrogation. Depp's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I think success means different things to different people," Depp replied calmly. "For me, it's about telling stories that matter, working with talented people, and hopefully entertaining audiences along the way." Morgan laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was the kind of laugh that made your skin crawl, the laugh of someone who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. "Come on, Johnny, you can be honest here. Your agent must be worried sick about your career trajectory. I mean, look at where you are now compared to where you were 15 years ago. It's quite a fall from grace, isn't it?" The attack was so blatant, so unnecessarily cruel, that the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Depp's publicist, sitting in the front row, looked like she wanted to intervene, but she knew her client could handle himself. Depp sat back in his chair, studying Morgan with those piercing eyes that had captivated audiences for decades. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was steel beneath the surface. "I think you might have me confused with someone else, Piers. I'm here to talk about my new film, which I'm very proud of. If you want to have a different conversation, maybe we should discuss why you seem so interested in tearing people down rather than building them up." It was a perfect response, calm but cutting. But Morgan was just getting started. He had come prepared for war, and he wasn't about to back down now. "Oh, I see. So now I'm the bad guy for asking real questions?" Morgan said, his voice rising slightly. "This is journalism, Johnny. This is what real interviews look like, not the softball nonsense you're used to getting from other shows." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. He was treating one of the most respected actors in Hollywood like a child who needed to be taught a lesson. It was uncomfortable to watch, and the crew members were starting to look genuinely concerned. Depp remained calm, but those who knew him could see the warning signs. His fingers drummed once on the arm of his chair, a subtle tell that he was reaching his limit. "I'm happy to answer real questions," Depp said evenly. "But there's a difference between journalism and just being rude to your guests. I came here in good faith to talk about my work." Morgan's response was swift and brutal. "Good faith? Let's talk about good faith, Johnny. What about all those legal battles you've been through? What about the personal drama that's followed you around? Don't you think your fans deserve to know about that side of Johnny Depp?" The question hit like a slap across the face. This was supposed to be about a new film, but Morgan was dragging up personal matters that had nothing to do with the interview. The line had been crossed, and everyone in the studio knew it. Depp's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He sat up straighter, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity that made everyone lean in. "My personal life is my personal life, Piers. I'm here as an actor promoting a film. If you want to gossip about celebrity drama, maybe you should consider changing careers to tabloid journalism." It was a devastating comeback, delivered with surgical precision. Morgan's face flushed red, and for a moment, he seemed to realize he had pushed too far. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his attack. Well, looks like I struck a nerve there, didn't I? Morgan said with that awful smirk returning to his face. The great Johnny Depp doesn't like it when someone asks him tough questions. Is that it? The studio was dead silent now. Even the cameras seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Depp looked at Morgan for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. I think we're done here. Those 5 words carried more weight than 1,000 angry shouts. Depp stood up slowly, with dignity intact, and began to remove his microphone. But Morgan wasn't finished. He couldn't let his guest leave with the upper hand. Oh, come on, Johnny. Don't be such a baby about it. Sit back down and let's have a real conversation. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Baby. Morgan had just called one of the most respected actors in Hollywood a baby for refusing to be disrespected on live television. The crew members looked at each other in disbelief. Even the most seasoned television professionals had never seen anything quite like this. Depp paused, his hand still on the microphone clipped to his jacket. He turned back to face Morgan, and for the first time in the interview, there was fire in his eyes. Not anger, not rage, but something far more dangerous. Complete and utter disdain. A baby? Depp repeated, his voice so quiet that the boom microphones had to strain to pick it up. Is that really the level of professionalism you want to display on your own show? Morgan seemed to realize he had made a mistake, but his ego wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he tried to play it off as a joke, flashing that fake television smile that fooled no one. Oh, lighten up, Johnny. It's just a bit of fun. This is television. We're supposed to entertain people. But Depp wasn't buying it. He had been in the entertainment business long enough to know the difference between entertainment and cruelty. He had worked with directors who challenged actors, who pushed them to be better, who asked tough questions in service of the craft. This wasn't that. This was just a man with a microphone trying to build himself up by tearing someone else down. Entertainment? Depp asked, his voice still unnaturally calm. Is that what you call ambushing your guests with personal attacks? Is that what you call professional journalism? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Morgan's producer was frantically gesturing from the booth, probably trying to signal him to back down, to apologize, to salvage what was left of the interview. But Morgan was too far gone now. His pride had taken over, and he was riding this disaster all the way to the bottom. Look, Johnny, I'm just trying to have an honest conversation here. If you can't handle a few direct questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. It was another low blow. Another attempt to make Depp look weak for refusing to be mistreated. But anyone watching could see what was really happening. This wasn't about honest conversation or direct questions. This was about a host who had lost control of his own show and was taking it out on his guest. Depp took a step closer to Morgan's desk, not in a threatening way, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally decided to stand up for himself. Direct questions? Depp said, and now there was steel in his voice. You want to talk about direct questions? Here's one for you, Piers. When did you decide that being cruel to your guests was more important than being a good host? The question hit Morgan like a physical blow. His face went red, then pale, then red again. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in the entire interview, he was speechless. But Depp wasn't finished. 20 years of dealing with difficult directors, demanding producers, and hostile journalists had taught him how to handle bullies. And that's exactly what Morgan was, a bully with a television show and an inflated sense of his own importance. You know what I think? Depp continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I think you're so desperate for ratings that you've forgotten what good television actually looks like. I think you've confused being controversial with being relevant. The words cut deep because they were true. Everyone in the studio knew it. Everyone watching at home knew it. And most importantly, Morgan knew it. His show's ratings had been declining for months, and his desperate attempts to create viral moments had been increasingly obvious and pathetic. Morgan finally found his voice, but it was shaky and defensive. Now wait just a minute, Johnny. You don't know anything about television. You're just an actor who plays pretend for a living. I'm a journalist. I have standards. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, to put Depp back in his place. But it only made things worse. The hypocrisy was staggering. A man who had spent the entire interview attacking his guest was now lecturing about standards. Depp actually smiled at that, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed the perfect weapon. Standards? Depp repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. Is it standard journalism to ambush your guests? Is it standard to drag their personal lives into an interview about their work? Is it standard to call them names when they object to being treated poorly? Each question was a perfectly aimed arrow, and Morgan was bleeding from every wound. He tried to interrupt, to deflect, to change the subject, but Depp wasn't going to let him off the hook. You want to know what real standards look like? Depp continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority as someone who had earned respect through decades of hard work and professionalism. Real standards mean treating your guests with basic human decency. Real standards mean doing your homework instead of just looking for cheap shots. Real standards mean understanding that your job is to inform and entertain your audience, not to feed your own ego. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Morgan sat there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, completely unable to respond to the devastating critique he had just received. But Depp still wasn't done. He had been pushed too far, and now all the frustration from years of dealing with people like Morgan was pouring out. You know what the saddest part is, Piers? You actually had a chance here. You had one of the biggest movie stars in the world sitting across from you, ready to have an interesting conversation about his work, his craft, his experiences in the industry. Instead, you chose to turn it into some kind of gladiator match for your own amusement. Morgan finally managed to stammer out a response, but his voice was weak and defensive. I was just trying to ask the questions that people want answered. I was being a real journalist. Depp shook his head sadly, like a teacher disappointed in a student who should have known better. No, Piers. Real journalists ask tough questions, but they do it with respect. They challenge their subjects, but they do it fairly. What you did here tonight wasn't journalism. It was just cruelty dressed up as professionalism. The indictment was complete and devastating. Morgan had been exposed not just as a poor interviewer, but as someone who had fundamentally misunderstood what his job was supposed to be. He had tried to destroy his guest and had only succeeded in destroying himself. Depp began walking toward the exit, his dignity intact despite everything Morgan had thrown at him. But as he reached the edge of the set, he turned back one final time. The moment stretched like an eternity. Every person in that studio knew they were witnessing something special. Something that would be talked about for years to come. Depp stood at the edge of the set, silhouetted against the bright studio lights, looking back at Morgan with an expression that was equal parts pity and disappointment. You know what, Piers? Depp said, his voice carrying across the silent studio like a final judgment. I actually feel sorry for you. The words hit Morgan like a thunderbolt. Of all the things Depp could have said, this was the most devastating. Not anger, not insults, but pity. It was the ultimate dismissal, the final proof that Morgan had lost not just the interview, but any claim to dignity or respect. Morgan's face went through a series of expressions, from confusion to anger to something that looked almost like panic. He had been expecting Depp to storm off in a rage, to give him something he could spin as the actor having a meltdown. Instead, he was being treated like a child who didn't know any better. Feel sorry for me? Morgan sputtered, trying desperately to regain some semblance of control. I'm not the one running away from a simple interview, but the damage was done. Everyone could see through the bluster now. Morgan's voice cracked slightly on the word simple, betraying how rattled he really was. Depp took a step back toward the desk, not to sit down, but to make sure his final words would be heard clearly by everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home. This wasn't a simple interview, Piers. This was an ambush. And the reason I feel sorry for you is because you don't seem to understand the difference. The observation was delivered with surgical precision. Depp's voice remained calm, almost gentle, which only made his words more powerful. He was speaking to Morgan like a disappointed father addressing a child who had misbehaved. Do you know what real power looks like? Depp continued, his eyes never leaving Morgan's face. Real power is being able to lift people up, not tear them down. Real power is using your platform to create something positive, not to feed your own insecurities. Morgan tried to interrupt, his voice desperate and shrill. Now listen here, Johnny. You can't just come on my show and lecture me about how to do my job. But Depp held up a hand, and somehow that simple gesture commanded more authority than all of Morgan's shouting. Actually, I think that's exactly what I'm doing, Depp said with quiet confidence. Because someone needs to tell you that what you did here tonight wasn't television. It wasn't journalism. It was just sad. The word sad hung in the air like a death sentence. Morgan's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment, everyone could see past the bluster to the insecure man underneath. He had built his entire career on being the tough guy who asked the hard questions, and now he was being dismissed as simply pathetic. You think you're so much better than me, Morgan said, his voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. You think because you're a movie star, You can just walk in here and disrespect me on my own show." It was a last desperate attempt to turn the tables, to make himself look like the victim. But it only made things worse. The whining tone, the self-pity, the complete lack of self-awareness. It was painful to watch. Depp looked at him with genuine surprise, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Disrespect you?" Depp repeated slowly. "Piers, I came here to talk about my work. I answered your questions politely, even when they were inappropriate. I tried to steer the conversation back to why I was supposed to be here. You're the one who turned this into something ugly." The recap was devastating because it was completely accurate. Anyone who had been watching could see exactly what had happened. Morgan had attacked, Depp had defended himself with class and dignity, and now Morgan was trying to play the victim. "But you know what the real tragedy is?" Depp continued, his voice growing softer but more intense. "You actually could have been good at this. You have the platform. You have the audience. You have the opportunity to do something meaningful. Instead, you chose to be small." The final insult wasn't an insult at all. It was the truth, delivered with such quiet certainty that it felt like a verdict from a judge. Morgan had been given every advantage, every opportunity to succeed, and he had chosen to waste it all on cheap shots and manufactured controversy. Morgan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? How do you argue with someone who has just calmly and methodically exposed every flaw in your character while maintaining perfect composure themselves? Depp began to walk away again, but Morgan couldn't let it in like this. His ego wouldn't allow it. In a final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage, he called out across the studio, Johnny, come back here, we're not finished." But Depp didn't even turn around. He just raised his hand in a small wave, not dismissive, not angry, just done. It was the gesture of someone who had said everything that needed to be said and had no interest in prolonging the conversation. "Actually, we are finished," Depp said without looking back. "We were finished the moment you decided to attack me instead of interviewing me. The moment you chose to be cruel instead of curious. The moment you forgot that your guests are human beings, not targets for your amusement." His voice carried clearly across the studio, and every word landed like a hammer blow. The cameramen kept filming, knowing they were capturing television history. The producers in the booth sat in stunned silence, knowing there was nothing they could do to fix this. Morgan sat alone at his desk, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. The big tough interviewer who prided himself on never letting guests get the better of him had been completely dismantled by a man who never once raised his voice or lost his temper. "This isn't over," Morgan called out, his voice echoing pathetically in the large studio. But it was over. Everyone knew it was over. Depp had won not through aggression or theatrics, but through simple dignity and class. As Depp reached the exit, he paused one final time, not to deliver another devastating line, not to twist the knife one more time, but to do something completely unexpected. He looked back at Morgan with what appeared to be genuine concern. "I hope you figure it out, Piers," he said quietly. "I really do, because you're better than this. At least, you could be if you wanted to be." And with that, Johnny Depp walked off the set, leaving behind the most spectacular television meltdown in recent memory. Not his meltdown, Morgan's. The host who had tried so hard to destroy his guest had succeeded only in destroying himself, and everyone had witnessed it happen in real time. It was a masterclass in how to handle a bully, not with anger or violence, but with quiet strength and unshakable dignity. Morgan was left sitting alone at his desk, the sound of his own heavy breathing echoing through the silent studio, wondering how everything had gone so terribly wrong.